start recording now. Welcome to Ed Glantz again. Tell our students what you were.
We had an opportunity. It was an app challenge to focus on high school students. So there were, I think, 20 teams originally, and they came in and they had poster demonstrations. And I was in class for that. David said that took several hours to get through all the teams. And then he narrowed it down to the 3 top teams, and I was there for the presentation. So now it was a PowerPoint. It was actually very impressive, very sophisticated PowerPoint Prezi demonstrations.
Really?
With real apps that they had configured on their cell phones. Not completed, obviously, not the back ends, but they were enough that they could simulate the techniques.
Oh, nice.
So two of them were health related. One was to try to use machine learning to detect symptoms of Parkinson's.
Wow.
The one group was all female, 3 girls. Yes, they were 3 females from the Washington, D.C. area. And their focus was on abusive or domestic violence, and their app would show you where the closest facilities are. But what was interesting was that app, you could mask it, so you could pick a different mask. The one mask was a pizza mask, so it would look like you were going to the pizza places in the area, and by clicking the pizza, it was actually relaying a message through 911 channels that you needed assistance, and it gave your location.
Wow.
So that was pretty sophisticated. Yeah.
That is. Do you know who won? Did they win?
No, I did the scoring, and then I had to run in to teach my next class. So the scoring, because we hadn't done it before, everyone did a point system, and then Daya was trying to total the points. But in hindsight, she should have just said, "What's your rank?" The problem with doing the points is some people were more difficult graders than others, so some people got a bias. I just thought if the rank was a little bit more consistent. I honestly don't know which one. Well, the one judge said I scored them all equally. That's how close it was. So
wow,
they were very, very excellent presenters and excellent content. It was that part was kind of amazing for high school kids.
Well, that's great.
Prizes were huge. I think first place prize was $5,000.
$5,000. Yeah, I know my undergrads wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
Wanted to sign up. Like, you can't. You have to be in high school. Get your brother or sister to sign up. All right, so it's 7:32. I see we've got 16. A bunch of other people will join us very, very soon. This evening I am pleased to have Dr. Ed Glantz with us. He is a faculty member in the College of IST, and before coming over to IST, he was in SMEAL, the business college. He's been around at Penn State since 1855. Is that right, Ed?
Yep, yeah, founder.
He's been around at Penn State for quite some time, not quite that long. And I look up to Ed. Ed is very tall. But I look up to Ed anyway. And I'm pleased to have Ed as a colleague, and he's also a member in the Center for Enterprise Architecture. Ed teaches in our security and risk programs at the undergraduate and graduate level, right, Ed?
Yep, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he is joining us tonight to talk about security and enterprise architecture. Does Ed teach IST 554? Ben wants to know. Ed,
no, but that's in the cybersecurity option, and
it doesn't. JR teach that.
I'm pretty certain JR was the course designer.
Yeah, JR teaches that, and that's part of our advanced enterprise security. What is that? NSEC certificate.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we have some very, very good classes in our cybersecurity MPS program, and some of those are made available to the enterprise architecture students. So I'm real excited about that.
Yeah.
That opportunity.
Right. So We're up to 17 now. We have usually get about up to 28 people. So, and they do a discussion. They do a discussion on every week, a discussion board, and I pull together the discussion themes. And this week, the discussion themes centered around 3 areas, and you'll be, my company is very security conscious. My company isn't security conscious enough. And the third theme was physical security is overlooked. I thought you would find that very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. And so we'll let you present first, and after you present, I'll go over those discussion themes. But I just wanted to highlight that because as Ed and I talk in with the Center for EA, I believe you all should have gotten an email from Sherry Hartman that forwarded the announcement for our upcoming Professional Development Day, which I spoke about last week, and that is on enterprise risk management and EA. And as the faculty are meeting to get ready for this day, this symposium, I've decided to call it symposium, physical security keeps coming up again and again. And I'm like, but that's not EA. That's not EA. We need to bring EA in. And then I read from my students, physical security is always overlooked. So there you have it. Well, Ed, without further ado, why don't I give you the controls here? I should have done that.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, good. Thank you.
And take it away.
All right. So I've kind of immersed myself really starting around 2008, 2009. I've started to really dig deep into security and risk analysis. And here I am, I don't know, 6, 7 years later, and actually I have more questions now than I did then. So the purpose of this presentation is more or less to give a quick overview of some observations, some simplifications, and actually then to hopefully have time for a little bit of a discussion at the end. So there's really 3 parts to this presentation. The first is just an orientation of some terms, because one of my observations is that we have a lot of people spending a lot of time on security and risk without really having a common set of definitions, so much so that when I talk to our faculty, because one of the classes I teach is our introductory undergraduate course in security and risk analysis. It's an introduction to our undergraduate degree. And I say, what do you want them to learn from this course? And they say, could they please give the definition of security? And so that's one of the definitions I'll show you in a second. So it's simple stuff, but it actually kind of helps guide and inform and influence what we try to do with it. And then just a couple cases in enterprise security and risk, and then hopefully a couple solutions. So here's a list of terms. The definition I said for security, it's real simple: freedom of protection from harm or difficulty. Implied here is for an asset, where an asset is something of value. So it's kind of a simple concept for the definition of security. And then there's some others here. The other one I want to talk about is this notion of a protector view. And this is something that comes from the literature, and I don't think this gets discussed often enough. I teach an upper level undergraduate class, and we're developing a graduate version of it just on risk analysis. And I tell the students, if I were to ask you to do a risk analysis on our facility, everyone would start running around and start listing, hopefully, threats and vulnerabilities. The problem is that it's going to have gaps. It's going to be incomplete. And that's why this protector view is one of the items, one of my observations that gets ignored and overlooked, and it's really critical. If you really want to do a risk analysis, it needs to be very, very thorough and complete. The protector view allows you to break this huge space into a very tiny piece and allow you to identify the assets that make up that piece, and then more fully explore the threats and vulnerabilities aligned with that. And I'll give you an example. If there's a jewelry store on College Avenue in State College near the university, one example of a protector view could be the employees of the store. They have one set of assets that are important to them. The customers in the store would be another protector view. They have a different set of assets. Some of them overlap. Some of them are shared with the employees, but some of them are unique to the customers. Some are just the people walking by on the street. Some of them, another protector view could be the first responders. So what I like about the protector view is it allows you to really shine a giant spotlight into the space to help identify all of the assets that are critical to that protector. And to do a complete risk analysis, you're going to have to really go through all of the protector views. It doesn't get you out of that. But by skipping the protector view, it makes you have holes in your analysis. So I just wanted to start out. That's one of my observations, is the importance of using a protector view to do a thorough risk analysis. We talk about the threat landscape that organizations are facing keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger with every single innovation in technology and information systems and the network. Also, the threats increase proportionally. I know whenever not that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, it was uncommon to have a broadband 24/7 connection. We used to use telephone modems. You'd take your phone line and hook your computer up and dial into AOL. And ironically, that was a much more secure environment than we have now. Now we have computers connected 24/7 to the networks, and they're oftentimes unattended. So it gives an attacker an opportunity to probe persistently without our awareness. So every new technology, innovation and frontier, mobile devices, cloud computing, every single one of these also comes with it a whole new set of threats. So this threat landscape keeps increasing. What this illustration is trying to show you on the left side here is the castle. We talk about security and layers for our defense, and this is something that should have meaning to enterprise architects, is that a system, if we're trying to protect it, we try to put barriers around it. And obviously the one on the outside would be the physical protection. You know, if I can keep you out of the whole space, then I'll increase security that much. And if I that much more, and if I put alligators in the moat and on and on and on. Anyone see any problems with this security in layers, this building defense in layers that we've been relying on for a long time now with our information systems? Anyone want to jump in here and volunteer anything?
I mean, there's no synergies between them, right? They're all kind of on an island.
Each one of the layers?
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, that's definitely one major observation. Anything else? It only takes a small hole in each. From Michael. What about Edward Snowden? What kind of a threat was that? Where would the security and defense layers protect against that? So this is our thinking as we're dealing with enemy actors, that if we can just keep the enemy at the gate, then we'll be protected. But we also have to realize that in some cases it's the people that we trust the most that have the keys to the kingdom that we have to be concerned about as well. So this is a little bit deceptive because it makes you put all of your defenses in increasing layers. There's another more subtle observation here too, and that is our security will be achieved if we add one more thing, one more item, one more consultant, one more device. We just add another layer. And at some point, it's like the story of the proofreaders. At some point, if we're still having errors, it's not a matter of hiring another proofreader. It's going back and just doing it right the first time. So that's also a part of this. We can keep adding stuff. And at some point, we need to go back and look at how we're doing things. So yeah, Snowden was internal. So all of those layers on the outside, he was supposed to be on the inside. So this one talks about the gaps and the blind spots and all these things that we don't anticipate. The zero-day attacks as an example. Socially engineered attacks, I think the number one defense, and having taught the capstone in our cybersecurity MPS program, these are a lot of people that are deployed. And they were extremely agitated about the social engineering threat. They were very comfortable with the technology, but they felt very, very vulnerable because of the weak link now really are the users in the system. And the most egregious example I've seen of this was in the last 2 weeks. I don't know why I didn't predict this, but in the last 2 weeks, I saw an article that said that people are just flat out selling their credentials. You want my password? Give me $100. So we've come full circle, I think, in this whole idea of what we need to do to protect and who actually we're protecting ourselves from. So the bottom line here is the threat landscape is getting bigger, and it's getting bigger at a very rapid pace. This was some research. I was skipping around and I found a table from this European Union agency, and it's a little bit small here. But what you can see is that a lot of the threats are listed down the left side, the top threats, and it's not so important what they are, but looking at the trend, a lot of them are increasing, and what the columns are representing are new frontiers. So we see mobile devices and cloud, and so other regions that were not exposed before are now exposed, and they're starting to increase. It's fortunate that our mobile devices still don't have the same level of vulnerabilities that our computers do. It's simply because hackers are very busy and have very lucrative businesses just attacking the computers, but it's not that our phones are that much more secure. So some other interesting things from this is this text on the left side of the slide. As I was doing some searches, and I hadn't even thought about this, this is issues that global companies experience when they're operating in other countries. Sometimes you don't have the choice. The other country will demand that you give them your software for security reasons, for legal compliance reasons with their country. So there's backdoors that can get created there. Also, shredding, so there's a whole lucrative business of being a shredder and then taking the documents and actually scanning them and stealing the data from them. So there's really no place that we should feel safe, or no entity that we should feel safe from. We have just an increasing number of threats that target us. And at the bottom there, I listed a whole bunch of other things. Weather-related, infectious disease, and industrial espionage. I'm kind of a fan of infectious disease, so I write stuff about that, because if our people can't get to work, then it doesn't matter if the systems are working right. So we talked about physical security, but it also implies physical security for the employees as well. So what I did in this slide is I'd gone through a lot of literature, a lot of standards, and I said, what does risk analysis mean to these different groups? And what I saw in all of them was a pattern, although they use slightly different terms. But at the end of the day, in, like, for example, human resources, risk management is a whole growing area because of disgruntled and violent employees. So there's a lot of different spaces you can go into, the financial sectors, not just DHS kind of sectors, but a whole bunch. And really, it's really simple what you do. You start, and I've added the protector view because that's not implied in any of them. But once you have that protector perspective, the steps that you go through, it's really only 4 major steps. The first is to identify and rank your assets, the things of value to you and your organization and that protector. The next thing is to identify and is all the threats and vulnerabilities that those assets are exposed to. This is very much a scientific and artistic combination of skills. This is not pure science. I've looked for literature to find really big laundry lists of here's all of the threats you need to worry about. They don't exist. So really, it's a custom project. And there's another thought embedded in that, is that when you do your first risk analysis, it's going to be flawed. It's going to be incomplete. You need to start a cycle and repeat the process as soon as you get it done, just so you can start and build and capitalize on all your knowledge and identify more threat vulnerability combinations. And then when you have your assets identified, you've identified the threat and vulnerabilities that you're exposed to, then you start to do scenarios for each of the high likelihood impact events and start to figure out what could happen. What's the likelihood of these events happening? What's the impact? And try to prioritize so the most valuable assets with the greatest exposure, those are the limited few that you're going to be able to allocate resources to protect. And this is another sad observation. We can't protect everything. So we have to be very intelligent about where we're going to apply our resources. And I prefer the phrase risk treatments. When I went through the ISO literature, this is the European body of risk literature that I was using. They don't even use the word risk control at all. Risk control is found in the NIST documents that the US likes to use. And that's one of my concerns. It's not a big deal if you use treatment or control, but the problem with control, in my opinion, is one of our most commonly used risk treatments is accept. Does anyone know what accept is for risk treatment? If we go through our big list of threat and vulnerabilities, the bulk of them we're going to have to accept. So what does that mean from a risk treatment or risk control perspective? No, accept, it's not an acronym. It actually just means do nothing, right? Actually, it's not do nothing. Accept means put it onto a watch list. But the majority of our risks that we identify, we have to accept. We don't exert any energy or calories or resources to treat them or control them. They're low enough on likelihood or low enough on impact, or the assets inconsequential enough that we put them onto a watch list. And that's not trivial. Some people have misinterpreted that to mean don't do anything, don't even worry about listing them, only worry about identifying the really critical threat vulnerabilities and ignore those other ones. And I have a problem with that because we don't know when that hazard is going to escalate from being dormant to armed and going on to being active. And sometimes that time frame can be very, very quick. So accept is not do nothing. It actually means put it onto a watch list and then just see if it starts, something about it changes that we need to escalate our attention to it. And so the idea of accept doesn't sound like you're actually controlling risk. You're just really watching it. And that's why I like the word risk treatment a little bit better. The risk management process is broken into two major pieces. The first piece is called risk analysis. That's done by the risk analyst. So we have students right out of college that are getting jobs as risk analysts. And risk analysis is broken into two parts. The first part is called risk identification. That's the identification of the assets and the identification of the threats and vulnerabilities. The assessment is where you try to evaluate the impact and likelihood of them and the value of the assets and try to assess them or do a prioritization of it. The risk analyst function ends with the analyst recommending treatments. And ideally, this would include this. I can't do this with undergraduates, but at the graduate level, hopefully we'll get into the security economics. So how much will your different treatments cost? So you would have more than one, perhaps, treatment for different risk scenarios. And ideally, you would try to quantify the expense because that's the language of business. This risk treatment that's listed over here on the right side of the equation, that's actually done by the executive decision makers in the organization. So the risk analyst is going to give them a very detailed report. Here's all the risk scenarios. These are the critical ones. And here are some risk treatments that we've identified. And here's here's the pros and cons, the benefits and the costs for each one. And then the executive decision makers have very, very limited constrained funds. They have to make very tough decisions about how to allocate money. So we don't control even all of the ones that the analysts would like to see controlled. At the end of the day, it's an issue of that executive decision maker being convinced. So, and I think a lot of us have dealt with decision makers, and we know how difficult that can be. But the more, and this is really important, the more effective we are at communicating and demonstrating that we've done a lot of due diligence, we've done a very articulate job of evaluating everything, then maybe we can be more successful getting buy-in for different risk treatments. I like this drawing because this is one of the few risk drawings I've seen where they actually show this timeline. So this is a flow from left to right of hazards on the left. They call them causes. So the hazards start on the left and they start to flow from the left to the right. The big red box in the middle means, okay, that hazard has actually gone to becoming either armed or active, and now it's going to expose our organization to some kind of risk, and then we can start to try to reduce the impact of that risk from escalating. We can put controls in place or treatments to deal with that. And this also does a nice job. So over on the right side, I've looked at a lot of literature, and I haven't not found any risk treatments that can't be put into one of these 5 categories over here on the right. So the accept is the do nothing. It's the put onto a watch list one. The avoid is where we change our operational strategy, we change our processes so that we don't go down a path. We're actually making a significant change in what we're doing to prevent the risk from being exposed to a risk. Accept is the most commonly used one, and avoid is the most preferred. I'm just glancing over here to the right. I'm going to be talking about the Office of Personnel Management event in a few slides, so that's something that really got my attention. Yeah, 4 million OPM applicants were exposed, but I think total it was 20 million because all of the applicants had friends and family that they had exposed all their personal identifiable information to. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. But what I like about this illustration, it bothers me in the United States, everyone uses the phrase, let's mitigate risk. We're going to mitigate, and I think you've all heard that, and you might even be guilty of using that. The problem with the word mitigation is it's describing a specific risk treatment that occurs on the right side of this red box here. It's basically trying to reduce the impact from the risk once it's occurred, from the hazard events once it's occurred. So we can, and really our mitigation word should include the word plan, mitigation plans, incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things that we can't control, whether it's going to occur or not. So we really are talking about mitigation plans. But my preference is if you like the word mitigation, use the word plan with it and be real clear. Mitigation is not a synonym for risk control or risk treatment. If someone says they're going to mitigate risk, what they're saying is we are going to accept the likelihood that this event is going to occur. We're not going to try to reduce on the left side of the red box. We're not going to try to reduce the likelihood. We're not going to try to avoid going down that path completely. And that may be true, and that may be unavoidable. But I'm also wondering, are we closing our minds and our protection and our defenses to an opportunity to maybe not even encounter or expose ourselves to a risk? So that's my big complaint with the word mitigation. I loved ISO because I did a word search. I didn't find mitigation at all. But guess what? I was just over in London a couple of weeks ago talking to their intelligence communities and Ministry of Defense, and they were all using the word mitigation. So I think the United States infected them at the national security level. But so anyhow, that's just I got pet peeves. That's one of them. And I understand why people do it. It sounds good, but really it's not a synonym for control or treatment. And this nice thing about this chart, it helps make it clear. The first thing you try to do is reduce the likelihood of an event occurring. Later, if that can't be done, you have to go to mitigation. The process of doing scenario analysis is pretty straightforward as long as you make these scorecards. So and the scorecards that a company chooses to use should be consistently applied across all of their risk portfolio items for continuity and consistency. So you have to put a little bit of thought into how you're going to score the consequences or the impact of a risk scenario, and at the same time, how you're going to evaluate the likelihood of a risk scenario. And these are just some examples that I have found. And then this is a simple chart at the top. This is not rocket science. You just have a matrix. You can put points on them, and then all you do is multiply them, and that kind of gives you an idea of which are the risk scenarios that are the most critical, the most likely, and the greatest impact. And then this is one way to do a risk evaluation. There's some others that are a little bit more involved. But this is pretty illustrative. And then, and by the way, there's no magic to these numbers. They're using 1 through 4 on both axes. That's not a rule. You could use 1, 5, 10, 15 for one and use a different set for the other one. So it's basically to help you communicate to the end user which are the assets that are, or which are the scenarios that are the most critical. And it's simple, so I like to share this one. And then when this example, I like the students to highlight it because then you can say everything that was rated 12 and higher, we have to come up with risk treatments for. The other ones we're probably going to have to end up accepting. So and the other ones are going to be watched in case they start to increase. That would be one way to use this to interpret risks. what we're doing, and this is really another important observation, we never are eliminating risk. So there's nothing you can ever do to eliminate risk. All you can do is shift your risk portfolio from one frontier to another frontier. And so there's some scholarly articles where they do a nice job when they're talking about homeland security or TSA operations, and they're showing if you do this, we're going to be on this threat vulnerability curve, and if we make this modification, we're going to try to switch to this curve. And it kind of is an important way to communicate that we're never eliminating risk. We're just sliding along curves or jumping to a different set of curves, so that if we're avoiding risk, we're trying to jump off this curve and go to a different curve. So just as an illustration. I love to collect risk and security standard examples. If you have any, I'd love for you to send them to me. I can add them to this list. The ISO and the NIST ones, I've spent a little bit more time looking at. Some of the other ones I've just found from the literature and just thought I would share these. Some are very specific to industries. Some are more generic. The NIST ones, they have some good stuff. They tend to be very cybersecurity specific in example, but in practicality, they're actually universal. And the other thing is the ISO stuff you have to pay money for. So for the students, I use NIST simply because it's free. There's things I like about ISO, but I don't like the fact that we have to pay money for them. So just for references here. Okay, so let's jump over and look at some cases. The OPM hack. This one really got my attention. So this was, I thought it was over 20 million identities. Everything. I mean, these, and I'm forgetting the form name. Something 86. Somebody will have to help me fill in with the letters before the 86 number. But when you apply for a security clearance, it's very, very, very comprehensive. Everything about your identity, social security number, health issues of you, your family, and then you have to give all of the similar information for your friends and family to SF86. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, it's a very, very complete, thorough document, perhaps the worst document you would ever want enemies to have. The Snowden stuff was very upsetting to the intelligence community and the defense community, but the sources and methods and so on. But this one to me is even worse because this is a cloud that hangs over people's lives for the rest of their careers. So this one to me was, technologies change, sources and methods change, but this is a cloud. And it wasn't just the 3 or 4 million that were actually applying for the clearances. It was all of their friends and family. And I've seen presentations where people have talked about this being done by, and I think China was one country that was mentioned, perhaps by another attack on health records. Again, China was mentioned. No surprise, it was a presentation by Mandiant. And the idea was that now I know what health vulnerabilities you have, and I have your health records, and I have your identities. So now I can start to use this information to put pressure on you and your pressure points. And so these are some really serious problems that come out of us. Actually, it says SF86 right on the slide. I thought this was going to be a line in the sand. I thought this event was going to cause a lot of people to say, what we're doing is not working. We need to make a major change. And I'm jumping back to whenever I got out of undergraduate school as an engineer, and this was right after the gas crises in the 70s in America, and we had to completely change our approach to design and engineering and production because we were getting beat badly by the Japanese, who had, because of World War II, completely re-engineered and rethought their approach to quality in their manufacturing processes. I thought this OPM hack was going to have the same effect as those oil crises, and it still might. This is only 2 years out. That what the message is, what we're doing is not working. Adding other layers is not working. Adding other consultants or firewalls or devices are not working. Not that they're not important, but we need more. And one question I have to ask here is, why were all of these records accessible through the web? There could be a very good answer for that. I don't know that. But one of the things that's implied and what's illustrated here is that people thought they were in the middle of the castle and they were secure and that they were willing to take that risk. What if instead our approach was more like quality, that you don't have 100% quality? You have to measure it and quantify it. And maybe in the beginning, your quality is pretty bad and you're only at 60%, but that gives you a metric to try to improve upon. But you're never, ever going to get to 100%. Probably the highest would be 6 Sigma, 99 point, and then several 9 after that. But that would also have an influence on, well, since we're not going to have perfect security, maybe I need to get some of these records off of the internet connection. Maybe I need to handle them through a different way. Anyhow, this remains to be seen whether this has this implication, but I'm likening it back to the quality revolution that took place in the United States beginning in the 80s. So these were some other popular things in the news. Boy, you know, that we're putting computers in mobile or in mobile access, and pervasive and ubiquitous computing is taking everything. So boom, the Jeep comes out. Great, we have internet connectivity. And then right away, there's an illustration. There's a really good video, if you're not familiar with it, where the hacker takes over the Jeep and controls the steering, the braking, took away all the control from the driver. Very, very scary video. Even worse because they did it on a real highway. They didn't have the foresight to do this on a track or on a private road. So it was terrifying for the driver to have that ride compromised. There was another big news event last year too, this United Airlines. This one I'm a little bit more skeptical about because this was actually a security researcher, and he claims that he was able to access and control the airplane through the in-flight entertainment system as a passenger. So he has a motivation to stretch the truth a little bit, and he very well might have done it. The FBI got involved immediately, and he might not be permitted to be completely truthful. But there's a little bit more incredulousness about that. The Chrysler one, the Jeep one, they actually have a videotape of it, so I believe it. Benjamin, wouldn't that be air gapped? Anyhow, scary stuff, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. This was a device. So some of my students said, "Oh, you got to watch this show, Mr. Robot," and I'm like, "Ah, yet another show." But it's actually very good. And they use this roll jam device, and there's blogs that evaluate each episode of Mr. Robot. They finished the first season. They'll be starting the second season pretty soon. So they use all these real hacking techniques in them, and then there's a blog that goes and evaluates, and they're getting thumbs up on everything. For their credibility. And this was one of the devices I used. This was a wireless device. They needed to steal a car, so they sat outside till someone used their wireless key on a car, and then this device captures the signal, and then they were able to open the car and steal the car. This idea of stealing that wireless signal is not new. What this device does here, this $30 device, makes it possible for any of us lunkheads in the room to go out and do it automatically without any real technical knowledge. And that's kind of the trend with a lot of these compromises is someone puts a lot of time and effort, very difficult in the beginning, and then at some point it becomes automated and rolled it out, and script kiddies and can take over and run with it as well. I'm laughing at the pitches and pitchforks thing, torches and pitchforks. Now, the other thing is when this roll jam attack was identified, the solution was also immediately identified that did not need to make it to this point of escalation. And that is that the codes need to expire. And that's exactly what happens with your Google authentication or the Duo code that you might be using to log into Penn State. We don't need to have codes that are good forever. What this device does is it steals the code and it makes the person push the button again. So the code that they stole is still active. So they can use it after the person leaves. And if the code's expired, then that attack wouldn't work. Very, very simple solution, not hard to implement. Tesla has been very aggressive in a lot of aspects of their car design, so much that I think they actually invited these people to attack their car, but either way, it was done in conjunction because they went to DEF CON together to present the big Tesla hack. This hack required these attackers to take the car apart. It was very difficult. And before they could go to DEF CON and present it, Tesla had already fixed the vulnerability. So it was kind of interesting how security conscious Tesla was. But this is, I think, unusual for a lot of companies, and we need to talk about that in a second. So this is where I want to finish up with before we go into the discussion. Where does EA want to be? Do you want to be a Band-Aid? Should we be a patch to this, or do we want to be part of the cure? And this is,